I thought what I might try and describe very, very briefly is what actually happened to me as a British diplomat, because if I have anything to say about ethics, I suppose it comes from that experience. And I'm reminded, I was thinking about what I was going to say this evening, I'm reminded of a former advisor to the British Foreign Secretary, when I was speechwriter to the Foreign Secretary, who said, there is no such things as morals, there is just what you do. I guess I learned this through a career of what I now look back on as an egregious moral failure in many ways. And so if my story has any lessons, it is about what not to do rather than what to do. So I don't feel particularly qualified to be up here 2 feet elevated above you all kind of lecturing on the matter. What turned out to be my final posting was here at the UN in New York, where I was posted to the UK mission to the UN. And I was part of the British delegation to the UN Security Council, where my responsibility was the Middle East, and in particular Iraq, and in particular the issue of weapons of mass destruction, how we would ensure the verified removal of Iraq's weapons of mass destruction, and how we would impose sanctions upon Iraq to coerce it to fulfill its obligations to disarm itself of weapons of mass destruction. And this, I had thought, was the kind of apex of my career, or rather a step up this ascending arc of my career, which would inevitably end in an ambassadorship or being a senior official back in London. But in fact, this experience turned out to be the nemesis of my career. And at the time, I didn't really realize it. But looking back, the signs were all there, including in the emotional state that I often found myself doing that kind of work. But the main part of my work was negotiating sanctions on Iraq. And I don't know how much people now know about sanctions on Iraq, but it tends to be overshadowed by debate over the war and did they lie or did they not. But in fact, in many ways, sanctions on Iraq were a far greater crime than the war that subsequently followed, because we imposed economic sanctions on Iraq, which affected above all the civilian population of Iraq and not the leadership, not the government of Iraq, who were the presumed targets of Iraq. The sanctions and the economic deprivation that followed sanctions caused considerable civilian suffering. We like to blame this on the Saddam regime. We said that if they fulfilled their obligations to allow inspections of weapons of mass destruction sites, then of course there wouldn't need to be sanctions in the first place. And now, when I look back on that time, I feel considerably ashamed of what I did, because I was an absolute intrinsic part of it. I negotiated the resolutions that imposed sanctions on Iraq. Line by line. I was known as a Rottweiler in the Security Council because I was so ferocious in defending the British-American line in the Security Council. In those days, the Security Council was divided between the Brits and the Americans, who demanded strict sanctions and strict weapons inspections as part of our policy of containing Iraq, and those who took a more, well, they wanted basically to let Iraq off the hook. This was France, the Russians, and others. And partly because the relationship in the Security Council between us and them was so incredibly antagonistic, it gave us a sense of kind of moral superiority, that we were defending the world against Saddam Hussein, that without us holding the line, Saddam would be allowed to rearm and kind of commit mayhem all over the world.